So many of the passages in the Gospel of John, you could rightly call them classic passages. This is another classic passage. It's a long passage. The 6th chapter. It involves an event, a miracle that's recorded for us in all 4 Gospels. When you look at John the 6th chapter and you were summarizing what takes place in John the 6th chapter, what is it? Feeding of the 5,000. That's the major event that's taken place. After Jesus feeds the 5,000, his disciples go away. What interesting thing takes place as far as Jesus being separated from his disciples and then being reunited with them? Walking on the water. That's kind of a unique way of catching up with people. And that's exactly what Jesus does. Okay, after Jesus reunites with his disciples, then the crowd eventually catches up with him. And we left off with the crowd talking to Jesus. And by the way, we're putting 2 and 2 together here. This will become more clear as we finish up this chapter. But why are the people coming after Jesus? Why are so many of the throngs of people? In fact, a lot of people will assess this and say, this is Jesus' height of popularity. Here it is. You know, they can't get away from the crowds. Well, that happened pretty early in his ministry. But here, it's like they want to make him king, right? They came right out and said that, and Jesus knows that that's what they want to do. But why? Why are they so wanting to find him and so enthralled with him? What's the motivation here?
They like a free ride.
They like a free ride. Yeah, because this is not just a free ride. This is a Cadillac. This is not just taking care of our daily needs. This is somebody who can take care of our daily needs and get rid of all of our enemies. Here's somebody who can give us independence from Rome and be the king that we've dreamed of having. And going back to the glory days, you know, how it used to be in the wilderness. Silly. Go back to those good old days when we were wandering around in the wilderness with no place to go, being punished by God. But you know what? You only think about the good parts. You know, where we were fed every day with manna and there was water, and God did provide. And I find it so interesting. God provided daily for his people, and these are the people that God wouldn't let into the promised land. So even though God wouldn't let them into the promised land, God still took care of them. God was still gracious to these people, still made himself known to them. Anyway, so they're thinking these kind of thoughts, and they want to come to Jesus, and even if by force, they have to use force to make him their king, they're willing to do that. Which, obviously, there's going to be so many points where it's kind of like, you didn't think that one through, did you? Somebody like Jesus, and even by their own account, if Jesus is the kind of person that they think he is, there's no way they can make him do what if he doesn't want to do that. So we left off here with the crowds coming to Jesus and talking to him. And Jesus, I want you to, I'm just going to go ahead and give you what I think we're going to find out as we go through this whole passage. It's as though, let me plant this seed in your mind. It's as though, instead of Jesus just talking to the crowd and reasoning with them, it's as though he's almost antagonistic. In fact, he's purposefully bringing up some issues, and the way he brings up these issues, and I think we're going to see it in these first few verses tonight, the way he brings this up is in such a way as he knows it's not going to make them happy. Please think about that. Here are the crowds, and they're all wanting to come together. And I guess the reason, maybe my prejudice here as a preacher is, when the crowds come, it's kind of like, aren't you supposed to say something to make them happy? Right? I mean, we've got all these people here. Let's keep them happy, because if you don't keep them happy, they might go away. This is the classic passage where Jesus makes everybody go away. And the way he handles crowds, it's convicting to me as a preacher. I think it ought to be convicting to us as Christians. Of course, we're here to make disciples. We're here to help lead people to Christ. But I hope we're never so concerned about getting as many people as we can that we aren't really discipling them. And sometimes the call to discipleship is a difficult path. And some people are going to turn away. In fact, I'm actually at a point in my life where I think you can partially judge success by the fact that some people reject you. In fact, I'll base it on one of the things Jesus said. He said, "Beware when all think well of you." If everybody likes what you're saying, you're probably not saying what you ought to be saying. Right? This is just a classic example of that. So let's pick up. Didn't we leave off around verse 50, 51?
51.
Okay, 51. He says, I am the living bread that comes down from heaven. Whoever eats this bread will live forever. This bread is my flesh, which I will give for the life of the world. Okay, from our perspective, and by the way, John wrote this quite a few years after the other Gospels have been written. He wrote this from a perspective where Christians and the early church reading this, and people will already know about Jesus, and looking back on this is going to make perfect sense, isn't it? I mean, from our perspective, of course, he's the one who gives us real life. He's the one who makes life possible. But put yourself in the shoes of the Jews who are hearing this the first time, and you'll see the response he gets in verse 52. Because we realize that, bread, food is a metaphor. Just like food sustains you physically, Jesus is the one who gives you real life, a relationship with God that goes beyond this life, spiritual life, right? So we understand the illustration, the metaphor here, but they're not getting it yet. Verse 52, then the Jews, did I point this out last week? When we use the term Jews, John tends to look at groups of people, and he'll either call them the disciples. Every time you read the word disciple, what does the word disciple mean? Okay, follower in the generic sense of the term. Somebody who's an apprentice, somebody who's being changed or transformed in the process of learning. So you could say a follower or a student, but a really good disciple is somebody who is actually a good student and learning and changing who they are. That's a disciple. Now sometimes John will distinguish 12 of those. And a lot of times he'll say the 12. But when he doesn't say the 12, you always have to ask yourself the question, is this just the 12? Because that term can be used for more. In fact, even in this passage, he's going to use it for more than just 12. Okay, let's get the other terms on the table, and then we're going to come back to disciples, right? We've got the 12. We all know the 12, right? Right, okay. We've got the 12. Then we've got disciples. We're going to use that term. Then we've got the term crowds. Okay, why would John sometimes say the crowds versus the disciples? What kind of distinction are you making in your mind?
Not true followers.
Yeah, crowds means anybody who's there, right? Doesn't mean people who are there just eager to learn more and teach me and everything else. Maybe it's because they want a free meal, or they want to see the miracles or something like that. So you have a much broader term when you have the crowds, right? But then again, John will use this term. He used it back up in verse 41. He uses it here in verse 52. He says the Jews. Okay, tell me, are there any Gentiles in this crowd yet? As far as we know, no. These are the crowds. These are the crowds that are going down to, on this occasion, right? They're going down to the Jerusalem for the feast. Okay, so we're talking about Jews, and you might think to yourself, well, are these just synonymous terms? The crowds, the Jews. No. Typically, John will use a different designation because he's trying to make a different point. When you use the term crowds, what are you referring to? Sheep without a shepherd. Mass of people that don't know what they don't know. But, by the way, that phrase rolls off my tongue a little too easily. That's a very important phrase. It's really important to know what you don't know. And if you don't know what you don't know, you're not going to learn what you need to learn. I'm not so sure I want to continue this, but I just want to make the point. It is so important. People get themselves into so much trouble. I'm sure I'm in this camp too. That if you don't know what you don't know, you're in trouble. Okay, let me go back. I'm getting so lost down these side trails here. Crowds just refer to the people in general, right? When John uses the term Jews, usually what's he referring to?
Those who oppose Jesus.
Those who oppose Jesus. Okay, what would be the smaller group of Jews who oppose Jesus? Sometimes he'll refer to, yeah, or he'll use the term religious leaders. Sometimes he'll say the Pharisees, but sometimes he'll say the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and we're going to see this tonight. Even the Pharisees and the Sadducees that we know. How do we know they don't get along? How do we know that?
Sorry.
Okay, it's in the Bible. That's good enough for me. That's right. But the classic example, Brother Rich mentions over here, is when Paul was figured out he's not going to get a fair hearing. He brings up the subject that the Pharisees and Sadducees disagree over. What's that subject? Resurrection from the dead. He says, that's what I'm really here for, because I believe in the resurrection of the dead. And all the people who agreed with him were saying, well, he's not such a bad guy. Right? And all the people who didn't agree with him, and so a fight, okay, so we know that they don't get along, but they unite against Jesus. They unite against Jesus. So you have the term the Jews. Sometimes religious leaders are Pharisees and Sadducees. But when John uses this term, he's usually referring to the people who are against Jesus, not there to give him a fair hearing. The crowds are more open-minded. They're ignorant, but more open-minded, versus the disciples who are learning, and specifically the 12. So we've got several terms here, but I wanted to get that in our minds, because when it says the Jews began to argue sharply among themselves, we're already predisposed the way John has used this term. These are people, they're arguing sharply among themselves, and what is it they're saying? How can this man give us his flesh to eat? Okay, if he just said some people in the crowd were saying that, I might have a little different impression here. But when he uses this term Jews, the Jews, the way he refers to them, this is usually people, they're not apt to follow Jesus in the first place. So why are they arguing the point?
To win the crowds over back to them.
Yeah. You've seen this, haven't you? We're really going to see a classic case of this. The most classic case, I think, is in John chapter 9. But we have a sampling here, and here's the case. They've already made up their mind. Now they're looking for the evidence. I know what I believe. Now I just have to find out why I believe it. Well, what does that tell you? When you make up your mind before the evidence. Okay, and probably because they do want to sway other people. We know that the religious leaders want to sway other people and want to get them away from following Jesus. Verse 53, Jesus said to them, okay, so what's the response? Jesus just said, if you really want to have life, what do you have to have? You have to have me. But how did he say that? You had to eat my flesh. Okay, and before we go on any further, I know that sounds kind of weird, but we understand the metaphor, right? Do we understand that? Just like if you say, can you picture it going to a really sick person and say, listen, you got to eat. You know, here's some food, here's some stuff. You got to take your medicine, you got to eat, you're going to be able to live. That's a picture of what Jesus is saying. You want a relationship with God? I'm the spiritual food. I'm the one who can give you that relationship with God. Okay, they don't get it, and they're upset. I think they're using it as an excuse. They're saying, what does this mean? We have to eat his flesh. And notice how Jesus responds in verse 53. Jesus said to them, verily, truly, and what does that mean? Amen, amen. It's a solemn statement. He says, I tell you, unless you eat the flesh of the Son of Man and drink his blood. What did he just do? He added something. And what did he add? It's the same metaphor, isn't it? Okay, but if a group of people are already having problems with this, which, by the way, we can guess why they're having problems with this, right? They're having problems with this because they don't want to believe. Now, I'm going out on a limb just a little bit, but I think we'll see this in just a few verses, okay? They're having problems because they don't want to believe, and so they're having problems with this. And instead of, this is the point I want you to kind of notice, instead of Jesus saying, oh, come on, guys, let me explain this to you. I'm just using a metaphor. That's not what Jesus says. Instead, Jesus said, yeah, you have to eat my flesh and you have to drink my blood. Do you remember what the Old Testament says about drinking blood?
Yeah, not allowed.
You're not allowed to do that. So what do you think the response is going to be from the people who are, what's this guy saying about eating his flesh? And as soon as he says drink his blood, they're going to be like, I knew it! Right? Right? All I'm trying to say is, instead of making this easier on the people, Jesus is actually kind of getting in their face and making it a little bit harder. We'll come back to that in just a second. If you eat the flesh of the Son of Man and drink his blood, you have no life in you. Whoever eats my flesh and drinks my blood has eternal life, and I will raise him up at the last day. Okay, before he said, this is the only way you can have real life. Now he also clarifies and says, it's not just real life, but you will be raised on the last day. He says, I'm the one who's going to make possible the resurrection for you. Verse 55, for my flesh is real food, and my blood is real drink. Oh, by the way here, the religious leaders, we made mention of this just a little while ago, not the Pharisees, but the Sadducees. What are the Sadducees going to say when Jesus said, not only do you have to eat my flesh and drink my blood, but you have to do that if you want to be raised in the last day? What are the Sadducees going to say?
And I don't like that.
He's pushing all their buttons, isn't he? He's just hitting all these issues that he knows these people disagree with. But, by the way, the crowds are still here. Have you ever done this? Have you ever had a conversation with somebody and you know, it's probably going nowhere, but I'm going to keep this conversation up because there's a few other people listening. So you're having a conversation with one person, but sometimes you go ahead and say stuff for the benefit of other people. I'll take this a step further. I think he's saying this for the benefit of a lot of people, not just in the audience that day, but for all time. And for a lot of people in the audience that day and today who read it and still don't get it. But someday you're going to come back to these words and they will make sense. So even if they don't make sense to you, in fact, I'll use a term that he's going to use. Does this offend you? He doesn't say, is this hard for you? Is this bother you? No, does this offend you? And it's as though he's saying, good, I'm glad it offends you. Maybe you need to be I don't mean to be facetious, but do you understand why I'm trying to emphasize some of this? I'm wondering if sometimes maybe we need to have our buttons pushed. We need to be hit in the face, so to speak. By the way, I was thinking about this earlier today. I was reading something. Do you remember in the Gospel of Mark, one of the classic ways that Mark describes Jesus' teaching, when people would say, nobody ever taught like him before. And then they'd add this phrase, he taught as what? One having authority. It's interesting to me because the root word that Mark uses there, the word that he uses there comes from a word that literally means to slap somebody in the face. And it just makes me think, you know what? A lot of Jesus' teaching is like, boom, boom, whoa. Right? It's one of those things that's kind of shocking and kind of gets to us. And maybe that's what we need to hear. Okay, so Jesus is purposely bringing these things up. He's already got a negative response. It's going to get worse. Verse 56, whoever eats my flesh and drinks my blood remains in me and I in them. I'm glad that he keeps saying this, because even though it's offensive to some people, he's not just repeating himself, he's explaining this. He's saying it's not just like bread gives you physical life, I give you spiritual life. I'll raise you up. So he's tying it to the resurrection. You want to have the hope of a future life, you got to have me. What else does he say? He says, eats my flesh and drinks my blood, remains in me and I in them. How does that help explain what he's saying here? What does he mean when he says, remains in me and I in them? What happens when you eat a pizza? What happens to that? I mean, don't get gross on me. But what happens to that pizza when you...
It becomes a part of your body.
Or what you eat.
And it provides... Yeah, right. Pizza is some of the greatest nourishing food. Yeah. But your body does something with it when it makes it possible. Okay, he's pushing the metaphor a little bit here, I think, on purpose, because the idea is, I'm not just here for you to use me. I'm not just your ticket out of hell or your ticket to heaven. I'm talking about like you take food into your body. I'm talking about following me, understanding me, living by my teaching and what you see in me. So he's pushing this a little bit more to help him understand. Verse 57, just as the living Father sent me and I live because of the Father, so the one who feeds on me will live because of me. This is the bread that came down from heaven. Your ancestors ate manna and died, But whoever feeds on this bread will live forever. By the way, why is he bringing up their ancestors eating on manna and dying? Because I wanted to ask this because we've been gone a week. Do you remember what happened earlier?
It's the bread from God, the daily bread that they received. So now he's trying to say this is just as important or more important than that.
Right.
Because
Remember
people
they
that
were
have
asking
died-
for a sign.
Right.
They're the ones who brought this up. This is what they wanted. Just like, hey, those good old days in the wilderness, you know. Wouldn't it be great if we had somebody like Moses again? And so Jesus says, let's think this through. Let's think about that. You guys want food that can take care of you physically. And so he's responding to something they've already brought up. Your ancestors ate that and died. Why are you only looking for something to take care of you physically? Do you remember what happened to those guys in the wilderness? And Jesus, I think, is saying, I offer you so much more than this. He said this while teaching in the synagogue at Capernaum. Okay, they've already gone to the other side of the lake. They're following him over there. John tells us this happens in the synagogue. One of the things that comes to mind, there's probably a lot here, but one of the things that comes to mind is, why do people go to a synagogue? Now, let me say it this way. Just general assumption, why do you think people go to church?
To listen to the word.
I'm guessing that maybe there's some sort of, I want to find God, I want to find out a little bit more about God. Don't you think that's a safe assumption? That's one of the reasons you go to church. Why are people going to the synagogue? And what is Jesus saying? You want to find out about God? I'm here. And I think he's really showing them that maybe that's not why you're here. You know, maybe you're fooling yourself. By the way, before we go any further, I need to make a comment on this. When Jesus says, eat my flesh, and then he also brings up this idea of drink my blood, some people have automatically gone to the idea, oh, Jesus is probably talking about Lord's Supper or communion. Okay. Do you understand that? Is Jesus talking about the Lord's Supper or communion? Well, let me throw it out there before I... Do you think he's talking about communion?
Somebody was.
Nobody wants to answer because I'm setting you up. What's the purpose of communion? Oh boy, that's too big of a question. 1 Corinthians chapter 11, verses 23 and following, Paul tells the church there at Corinth the purpose that we have in observing the Lord's Supper, communion. We do this because Jesus tells us to do it. And he tells us to do it so that we would remember. We would remember we have a new covenant relationship with him. We remember what he did in dying for us. We also take time to examine ourselves. So he mentions all these things that take place during communion time. So there's a sense in which when we take the bread that represents his body and the juice that represents his blood, there's a sense in which we remember he's the one who gives us life. So there's a sense in which, okay, I can go with the fact that communion reminds me it's Jesus is the one who gives us life. But that's the real point he's making here. Just like food sustains your physical body, Jesus is the one who gives us life. Some of the early church fathers, they call them church fathers, leaders of the early church. There's a guy by the name of Justin Martyr. Have you heard this guy, of this name before, Justin Martyr? Justin Martyr was was born maybe 10 years, less than 10 years after John died. So as far as church fathers go, he lived like between the year 100 and 170, right around in there. And Justin Martyr was one of the early people who thought that Jesus was teaching about communion. I think it's more than that. I think communion reminds us about Jesus, reminds us about our relationship with God because of Jesus, but it's more than that. But I wanted to bring this up because I copied this down. Justin Martyr thought that for communion, for anybody to partake in communion, his comments were they had to believe the teachings, they had to have faith. So he said nobody should be allowed to take of the bread and the juice during their services unless, first of all, they prove that they really believe this And secondly, that they had already been baptized as a proof of their faith. In fact, the way he words it is as an expression of their faith, they were baptized into Christ. The reason I love that so much is here's somebody who lived 100 to 170. He is saying clearly what the Bible already teaches. The early church got this. The early church got this. Okay, so did I answer that question? It reminds us of this, but don't limit this to Jesus' teaching on just communion. He's talking about, just like bread provides you life, Jesus is the one who provides us with the relationship with God. New life and the resurrection he mentions as well. Verse 60, on hearing this, many of his disciples said, okay, when it says many of his disciples, is this just talking about the 12? And how do we know it's not just talking about the 12? Because if you read ahead a few more verses, he's going to talk to the 12 in just a minute. Okay, so the term disciples, just remember this, these are the followers. Many of his followers said, this is a hard teaching, who can accept it? So the reason this is shocking to me is we're not just saying the Jews said that. What do the Jews say? They're already mad, right? What's this guy saying? And you can almost hear the antagonism in the way they say it, back up in verse 52. And it's not just the crowds. These are the disciples who are having a hard time with this. Verse 61, aware that they're having this difficult time, here's what Jesus says. Aware that his disciples were grumbling. When you use the word grumbling, what do you usually mean?
Under your breath?
Yeah. It doesn't sound very positive, does it? It's not like, oh, we love this. No. This is, why is he bringing this up? Why can't it? Doesn't this make you think of, there's 7 days in a week. There's so many different days people can be healed on. Why does it have to be the Sabbath, right? Doesn't that sound like grumbling? Anyway, aware of the fact that the disciples were grumbling about this, Jesus said to them, does this offend you? Now here comes the apology. No. Does this offend you? Then what if you see the Son of Man ascend to where he was before? Okay, before we go further, I want you to see what Jesus just did there. Jeremiah, when he complained to God about how difficult it was to be a prophet, God said to Jeremiah, if you're running out of gas, running with footmen, what are you going to do when I let the horses loose? What did God mean when he said that to Jeremiah? You think it's difficult now? It's going to get worse. It's going to get worse. Wouldn't you love to get an answer from God like that? Sorry. Okay, so what is it that Jesus said? Does this offend you? Then what if you see the Son of Man ascend to where he was before? In other words, he's saying, if this is hard for you to swallow, it's going to get worse, guys. Okay, can we stop there for just a second? Why does this offend them? Why does this... The reason I want us to take this step is, he's saying, this is hard for you, it's going to get worse. So let's analyze, what makes this so hard? What makes this so hard?
Probably part of the traditions, some of the traditions.
Good answer, Roger. I think that obviously especially from all the Gospels, one of the things we see are that people are so programmed to think one way. Their traditions, the way they approach things. And Jesus comes along and shakes them up. Just made reference just a few minutes ago to the healing on the Sabbath. Jesus purposefully healed on the Sabbath. Purposefully. To get them to re-examine their teaching on the Sabbath, because they got some things wrong and they needed to be challenged on some of these things. Okay, it's hard for them to understand. It challenges what they believed before. But let's go one step deeper. What specifically was Jesus saying? What did he mean when he said you have to eat my flesh and drink my blood? What did he mean? Just like food gives life to you physically, Jesus is the one who does what? Okay, so what is it that's going to raise you on the last day? What is it that's going to give you a relationship with God? What is it that's going to give you spiritual life? Jesus is going to give you spiritual life? You mean it's not? Keeping track of the 613 laws I've been working at so hard? You mean that's not? You mean the scales I look at every night when I go home and I keep record of my good deeds versus my? You mean that's not it? You mean as Jesus is the one who gives me life? If that's part of what they're having difficulty with, and no doubt under the Jewish system, that is one of the things they're having difficulty with. Jesus is saying, well, you better get this one down, because if you don't get this one down, you're not going to have life. Not only that, you're not going to be ready for the next thing. And by the way, what's the next thing that he mentions? He says, if this offends you, then what if you see the Son of Man ascend to where he was before? Where was the Son of Man before? Yeah. If this teaching disturbs you, what if you see other things that don't fit into your way of looking at things? What if there's more stuff to challenge you? Notice how he explains this. He says in verse 63, the Spirit gives life, the flesh counts for nothing. Okay, if you go back to this idea of, the scales or the way they're looking at trying real hard, he says if you want life, it doesn't come from how well you can live your life. That's a gift from God. And that gift from God comes through, he's saying, I'm here. That's what Jesus is trying to get him to understand. Okay, the Spirit gives life, the flesh counts for nothing. The words I have spoken to you are full of the Spirit and life. Doesn't this make sense? He's saying, this is what's going to give you life. That's why you need to listen to this. Verse 64, yet there are some among you who do not believe. For Jesus had known from the beginning which of them did not believe and who would betray him. You're going to see down in verse 70, he's going to say this specifically. We already know this. Who's going to betray Jesus? Judas. He went on to say, this is why I told you that no one... This is why I told you that no one can come to me unless the Father has enabled them. Okay, let's review this really quickly. He already said this. How does the Father enable somebody? How does the Father, here's the term he used, draw. How does the Father draw people to Jesus? How does he do that? Through the Word. Through the Word. So it's as though... I'm sorry, the metaphor just came to mind. It's as though you turn the light bulb on for the moths, right? But forget that metaphor. God puts the Word out there, and the Word is like the magnet. The Word is that which looks appealing. Okay, so God uses the Word to draw people. What do people have to do?
Choose to respond to.
They have to, people still get, the point I'm trying to emphasize, God draws people, he puts the Word out there, it's like, here you go, but it's not irresistible and it's not overpowering. Faith comes by hearing the Word of God. So God puts the Word out there, and everyone of their own free will either decides to hear that or not, approach it or not, accept it or not. Right? So God does this through his Word. In fact, while he's saying this, flip over to chapter 7 for just a second. I wanted to put some of these verses together. Look at chapter 7. Yeah, look at chapter 7. Look at verse 17. Verse 17. He says, anyone who chooses to do the will of God will find out whether my teachings come from God or whether I speak on my own. Did you notice that phrase? He says, anyone who chooses to do... Well, I thought he said it's only the people that God chose. But who is it that God chooses?
Those who choose him.
God chooses those who choose him. And so, depending on which part of this he's going to focus on, he'll say this from both sides. God puts the Word out there so we of our own free will can make the choice to respond to it or not. And those who do respond are the ones that God is drawing. Okay, so I lost my place again. Where were we in chapter 6? 63? Thank you. Okay, 64. And yet some of you do not believe. Jesus knew from the very beginning which one would betray him. That'd be Judas, verse 65. He went on to say, this is why I told you that none can come to me unless the Father enabled them. From this time, many... Oh, by the way, verse 66, do you have a different translation there where it says from this time?
As a result of these.
As a result, that's good. Because it could be translated, probably should be translated, because of this. Or as a result of this. Many of the disciples turned back and no longer followed him. So teaching gets tough, and they leave. Verse 67, you do not want to leave too, do you? Jesus asked the 12. Okay, now we have the 12. So Jesus, here's the picture. The crowds, the masses, and everybody, they're following Jesus. They want to make him king. And Jesus just starts to challenge their thinking. What do you really want? Do you understand who I really am? And if you understand who I really am, that's great, because I can give you life. But you've got to understand this. And they couldn't understand it, or didn't like what they were understanding. And so since it was difficult and offensive, they leave. And Jesus turns to the 12 and says, do you want to leave too? Simon Peter, who's often the representative or the mouthpiece, the one who speaks up more than anybody. Simon Peter answered, Lord, to whom shall we go? You have the words of eternal life. I love the way he said this, not just for the fact that obviously there was a lot that the 12 didn't understand, right? But they understood this most basic point. What's that? Jesus is the bread of life. Well, what does that mean? Notice the way Peter answers this. He said, you have the words of eternal. In other words, he understood. Let me finish verse 69. We have come to believe and know that you are the Holy One of God. The we there is in the emphatic position. He's saying we 12 are not like the other people. It's as though he's saying, hey, we're not like the rest of them. We know better. We know you're the one who has the words of life. In other words, he's saying, Jesus, we get what you're saying about being the bread of life. They may not understand it all, but they get this. You have to have him to have God. Willie?
This is similar to why he spoke in parables. He was saying that,
Yes.
the ones that really searched out the real answers to understand what he was talking about, because everybody was confused, would be the ones that really searching out the truth.
Yes.
So it kind of, now it's gotten to the point, it's just the 12, period.
Yes. Yeah. It's so true. Jesus said it's those who seek that find, those who knock, the door will be open. And it's God does put his word out there, but people have to make the effort. People have to make the effort. That's right. Your point about getting down to the 12, that's very, very true. Let's go ahead and play off that just a little bit. Does Jesus, I don't want to ask that question, sorry. Jesus gets down to, everybody else leaves, it's just the 12. How long is Jesus' ministry?
3 years.
Yeah, let's say 3.5. 3.5 years. John, more than anybody else, helps us out with that, because we have a total of 4 Passover feasts. So you've got 3.5 years here. So anyway, for 3.5 years, Jesus' ministry is, even when the crowds are around, he's more, when we're given detail, it's as though Jesus is almost always focused on the 12. So he may be feeding 5,000, but he wants to make sure the 12, he quizzes them. What are you going to do about this? He wants them to really understand. He lets them see him walking on the water. He's going to spend time with 12, and you might look at his ministry and say, but you could have had hundreds of thousands. Sure he could have. Of course he could have. He chose to focus on 12 men. And by the way, even the 12 he focused on, he lost one. Right?
At that point, yeah.
Right? But he trained those 12 men so well that when he left, those 12 men and 120 others, in a matter of a very short period of time, started multiplying by the thousands. Yeah. I just think there's a very important principle here. Yeah, and I think it's a principle of discipleship. I think I'm never for just ignoring people, but I think spending a lot of time training intensely with people. I think there's a good principle. And Greg, what were you going to say?
You said it before I could. And obviously, he was going to get his thousands, and
yes,
through these guys, it's obvious the investment was
yes,
the church and everything that was to come.
Yes. Okay, so Peter, a lot of people will say this is one of his finest hours. I would say that. Everybody else turns away, and Peter says, no, we know you're the only one. Peter got to say quite a few things, such as the confession that he made, that you are the Christ. But here's one of his great sayings. We know that you're the only one who has words of life. Verse 70, Jesus replied, have I not chosen you? The 12. Yeah, one of you is a devil. Okay, we've already talked about this. God chooses those who choose him. This is a great example of it, because of the 12 that he chose, not all of those chose him. 11 of them did, right? When he uses this term devil, do you have a different translation for that? Very appropriate. Does anybody remember what the word devil means? In fact, it's sometimes translated devil. Other times it's translated this other way because it's what the word means. It means slanderer. Slanderer. Yes.
Well,
Yes.
but he had to choose him, because if he didn't choose him, he wouldn't have been crucified to save us. So there was a purpose in him choosing him.
Okay, there was no doubt a purpose, and I have no problem with saying it that way, as long as you don't say that Judas didn't have a choice.
Oh, he had a choice.
He had a choice.
But I think Jesus knew what his choice was going to be before he even picked him.
Perfectly agree with you. That's where most people get confused on this subject of Romans 8:28 and verse 29. God chooses based on who he knows. In fact, it uses the term foreknowledge. What God knows in advance, since God already knows the choices you're going to make, he's not caught off guard. And he can make plans based on that. But it doesn't do away with our choice. Anyway, let's finish this off. Is that yet one of you is a devil? He meant Judas, the son of Simon Iscariot, who, though one of the 12, would later betray him. Chapter 7. We'll get into this just a little bit. After this, Jesus went around Galilee. He did not want to go about in Judea because the Jewish leaders there were looking for a way to kill him. Doesn't this sound like chapter 5? Remember in chapter 5 when he heard that the Jewish leaders realized that he was baptizing more than John, although he throws in that parenthetical statement to say it wasn't really him, it was his disciples that were baptizing. What did Jesus do then? He leaves the area of Judea and goes up through Samaria, meets a woman at the well, right? But he goes up there. Anyway, that's the beginning of the 4th chapter, and then again at the 5th chapter, we read this again. In fact, as we go through here, there's a growing hatred of Jesus, and Jesus will eventually confront them. But he doesn't want to bring his ministry to a premature end. And so, he's not wanting to stay in the area of Judea right now because he knows that they want to kill him. This is going to come out a little bit more in this chapter, verse 2. But when the Jewish festival of tabernacles was near. It's one of the 3 major festivals. What are the other 2 major ones? Passover. Tabernacle, Passover, what's the 3rd one? Pentecost. And these 3 major ones, the Jews were required to come back to Jerusalem to observe these Passover. Yes, these feasts.
The ESV translates it Feast of Booths. I've never heard that before.
Thank you. What does the word tabernacle mean? Tent. What's a booth?
Same thing.
A tent.
I guess
It's another way of saying
I
tent.
think a phone booth, that's the problem.
Yeah.
Like a display.
You're dating yourself. Okay.
That's why.
Part of the requirement of this, why'd they call it the Feast of Booths or Tabernacles or Tents? Why'd they call it that feast? Because everybody was required during that week to
Live in a tent.
live in a tent. Live in a tent. So even if you had a house there in Jerusalem, guess what you did? Went up on the roof, and they had flat roofs, pitched a tent, right? Okay, do you know one of the requirements of your tent?
Did it have a roof?
No, it had to have holes in it.
Oh,
Why did it have to have holes in the roof?
seeds go.
People can come in from
It's got
Well, not that big of a hole. For Santa Claus to come. No. No, if you're laying in the tent and there's a hole in the tent, you're going to be able to see the stars. You're going to be able to see out. One of the requirements, as I understand this, was they had to have a way to see the sky. Now, why in the world, number one, would they want to stay in tents all week long? And number two, why is it they'd want to be able to see the great outdoors?
They were representing being in the wilderness.
This was the feast that was focused on how God took care of their ancestors while they were in the wilderness. In the wilderness, living in tents without permanent homes. So they remember that period of time. The reason that's significant, how is it that God provided for them while they were in the wilderness? What do you have to have human life? Food. And I know people like me, I'm more concerned about food, but you can go a lot longer without food than you can without hydration. That's right. Water. Well, how did God provide water for them? From the rock. According to 1 Corinthians chapter 10, who was the rock? Jesus. I love that. In fact, 1 Corinthians 10 tells us what about that rock? It followed them. I'm just waiting to see that video. Can you see 2 million people walking along and this big rock just... I have no idea how that... It just said the rock followed them throughout the world. Maybe it just appeared every time they needed... Whatever. From this rock, they're able to get water. So, here we are over 1,400 years later. Is that right? Several years later, remembering their ancestors, and in the Feast of Tabernacles, as you remember this, to remember how God took care of them, staying in tents every night, but every day. In fact, they started off in the morning, and the priest would have a parade procession. It was part of the festivities. Some commentators will say that this was the most Christmas-like celebration that they had. People would literally get gifts and give gifts to one another at this time, because it was just a great celebration time. Stay in tents, and every morning there would be a procession. There was musical accompaniment associated with this, and the priest would go down to the pool of Siloam, and they would fill a large pitcher of water. And they would quote from Isaiah 12, I think it was. There's some particular passages that they would quote from that would talk about God providing for them the water of life, right? And they would be quoting these passages as they came in this big procession. Can you picture, whatever, big procession coming back into town. And when they come back to the temple, this was a sacrifice, but it was a liquid sacrifice, and you call a liquid sacrifice what? Libation. You call it libation. So instead of, sometimes they burn animals, sometimes they offer grain. At this time, they would pour the water out. Huge thing. Okay, that took place every morning. You know what they did every night during this celebration? I'm almost out of time. They had, again, Josephus is the one who gives us the most information about this. And as soon as I say that, what do we need to keep in mind? Take it with a grain of salt. Right? Because he said there were these large, and if I remember correctly, 4 large towers that would have these basins on them, and they were placed strategically in the courtyard area. He said that the ladders that the young men would climb to reach the top of these were 75 foot. That's a big ladder. That is a big ladder. So, but let's go with what he said.
You missed the decimal point.
The way he describes this, he said 75-foot ladders. The young men, when the sun would set, would go up there, and these large basins, like tubs that are at the top of these towers, would be filled with oil that they would light. So you would literally have these 4 large bonfires on these large pillars at night. Why do you think they did that during this celebration?
Because God was there, pillar of fire.
Pillar of fire at night. According to Josephus, it would literally light up the whole courtyard area. I bet it would too. But one of the things that I think is important to keep in your mind, this is before electricity, this is before all that stuff, and to have something elevated like, you'd had bonfires before, but to have something that extravagant, that, people probably saw it from miles and miles. It was probably quite a grand thing. So it was, the light was pictured there, but the water was also pictured there. And what we're going to build up to, what we're going to get to next week is this. It says, on the last and greatest day of the feast, Jesus is going to stand up. And what's he going to say? If any of you are thirsty, picture this. They bring in this water every day. God provides the water. And Jesus stands up, and it uses a term to say that he yelled. I want to get everybody's attention. And you know what he said? If you're thirsty, you need to come to me. Wow. What a declaration. When everybody's thinking, God provides water, and Jesus says, nope, you need it from me. It's like major thing. Okay, so here we go. This is the Feast of Tabernacles. And what we have here, and let's go ahead and get the next two verses, and then we'll quit for tonight. It says, Jesus' brothers came to him and said, leave Galilee and go to Judea, so that your disciples there may see the works that you do. By the way, has everybody heard about the works that Jesus does?
Yeah.
Yes. It's obvious that the brothers are at least aware of this. They've likely seen some of his miracles themselves. But notice they say, go ahead and go down. You need to get down to Judea. This is an important time. So everybody can see the works that you do. No one wants to become a public figure, acts in secret. No one who wants to become a public figure acts in secret. Since you are doing these things, show yourself to the world. Okay, if that's all that was said, you might think, wow, his brothers are his campaign managers. You know, they're really promoting him. But look at the next verse. Verse 5, for even his own brothers did not believe in him. Can you name one or two of Jesus' brothers? Which James? The James who wrote? James. Can you name another one? The Jude who wrote? Jude. Yes. Yeah. They were very important leaders in the earlier church, but during Jesus' earthly ministry, they didn't believe in him. Okay, we'll come back. We'll start with this, because notice what they said. They pointed to his miracles, aware of his miracles, probably even seeing his miracles, and they still didn't believe in him. How do you explain that? Well, I'll let you explain it to me next Monday night. Okay, let's pray. Dear Heavenly Father, thank you for these men who've come out tonight. Thank you for this opportunity we have to study together. And I'm just mindful of the fact that the passage we talked about tonight, people were offended. And God, many of the things you say we hold on to as precious words of life, and they're just encouraging to us. But some of the things that your word clearly says are not easy for us to swallow, and they do challenge us. But I pray that we will not be those who go away because we don't like it. We'll be like Peter, who stands up and realizes that you're the only one who has words of life. Even if some of them are challenging to us, help us just to learn and grow and draw all the closer to you, and let you be our God. In Jesus' name I pray. All right.